All right. Hello. And we are here to talk about the end of youth ministry. How fun does that sound? Andrew Root has a new book called newish, I guess, book called The End of Youth Ministry: Why Parents Don't Really Care About Youth Groups and What Youth Workers Should Do About It. And I was wanting to read it, thinking about it, and then also you were thinking about it, and we just ended up deciding to read it quarantined together in separate states, but we read it simultaneously, I guess, and thought it might be good to share our thoughts. So I'm Nathan Wheeler, and I'm the coordinator of youth and young adult ministries for the Cumberland Presbyterian Church.
I'm Samantha Hassell. I am a youth pastor serving in Sturgis, Kentucky. And just this week, actually, little known fact, I'm celebrating 19 years as a youth pastor. Yep, I started at my first church. I remember very specifically, it was May 6th because I moved to Nashville on May 5th because there was a huge Cinco de Mayo party happening in the apartment below the one we moved into. So I just always know we moved on May 5th and I walked in on May 6th. To start my first call. So.
Well, then basically we'll be able to take this book, implement it perfectly, and end youth ministry, because that's what this book's about, right? This book was written to end youth ministry, I believe. When I first got or first came across that this was a book that he had written, one, I was intrigued because of Andrew Root. Both of us share an affinity for him. We think he's very insightful, helpful, and really just kind of any book that I hear that he has written, it instantaneously makes me want to go and see what he has to say.
Right.
And, for this book, the title, it seems pretty ominous, seems pretty doom and gloom, but it's not that at all. It's actually about joy, and more so it's about how joy is the reason for youth ministry. And it kind of ties together a multitude of books that I feel like I've read by Andrew Root. It kind of seems like that's where he's been heading, and this is kind of I don't know if it's a culmination necessarily, or more like a clarification on what he's been talking about in some other books, like Bonhoeffer as youth worker and his faith formation series. And basically he positions it, I guess, as a wide narrative thought on the book is basically, this is about how youth ministry is uniquely positioned to take advantage of situations that, are generally occupied by other areas. And we notice that every book we read basically is the downfall of the church, and we're losing younger generations and stuff like that. And this is kind of a step back to look, okay, yes, we recognize that, and we've come up with a multitude of ways of how to combat that, but let's get back to the core of why we even do youth ministry. What about you? What do you see as like a larger concept, or what do you think that this book is about?
Well, I think that, yes, to everything you said, but to even back up before that, he kind of, one step before what you're talking about, he does a good breakdown with some good theology. And then the beginning of the book is sort of this cultural analysis of just young people today, families today. And he's not, of course, the first he's not the first person or theologian to write about this, but he kind of takes this look at cultural realities that are then shaping the church. And kind of what I got was that a large component of those realities is just the overscheduling of young people, how busy and overbooked they are. There are so many good things for youth to be involved in, But then because there are so many good things for young people to be involved in, youth group ends up being just another thing. Um, and he kind of makes the case that up against all the other things that there are for young people to be involved in, the perception is maybe that youth ministry doesn't offer in return what some of these other things offer, and that's why it gets kind of pushed to the side. So he does this sort of cultural analysis and is really encouraging churches and youth pastors to take a step back and consider why we do what we do and what could need to be done differently. Because as youth pastors, we don't want to just be offering another thing for young people to be involved in. But if that's true, then we have to kind of examine our practices and what we're doing and how what we're doing looks different than the world. Like, we want ministry relationships to relate to young people in a way that's distinctive. We don't want what we're doing to look like a team or a club. If it does, then we're missing the mark. So to me, that's kind of what the book postures people to do. And then I'm with you. Why not, during a global health crisis, also read a book about how your entire call and way of doing life is about you?
What you've wasted 19 years on doing.
Right, you're right. The world is falling apart, and so is youth ministry. So why did I even get out of bed today?
Yeah, which is nice that that's not really the shape it takes, right. Because I think that that book exists. I think that there's plenty of those books that offer us a lot of reasons why things have gone downhill as far as involvement and faith among younger generations. I feel like that there's a plethora of that. Particularly, I think the first one I read was the book on Christian. And then I feel like from there, it just kind of, many books kind of just started from that. And I'm sure that there's, I'm not like read every book in the world, but I'm sure there's a plethora of them that are very similar, speaking about that. But that's not really the shape it takes. And one of the things you mentioned that brought something to mind is that you had talked about how he shows that basically things that youth group maybe had the corner marketed on for a while began to be taken over by other things that had happened previously, but now they've taken more precedent as culture has kind of shifted, and parents are looking for something different, and they're not finding it in those spaces that we call youth ministry. They're finding it in, I guess one of the things he says is helping kids find their thing. Their thing is not being in youth ministry, it's other things. It's kind of lost its grip in that. And, for me, I would say that's one of the things that really resonated with me in my experience in youth ministry in general, is this noticeable shift from the time I started in youth ministry and how easy it was to work with kids' schedules, and how easy it was to get parents on board, and how simple it was, particularly in my contextual youth ministry, which was pretty middle class, which is a lot of what he's speaking to, is the wider complex of youth ministry. Maybe not specific ones that exist in different bubbles, but like kind of the wider thing that's marketed and talked about at big conferences and written about is kind of like that middle class wheelhouse. At least most youth ministries kind of come out of that from the 80s and 90s. But, I've seen a shift for sure on how easy it was to get people on board and to do those things, and how parents looked towards those things. And then I was sharing an experience with you about, one of the youth ministries I was in, they kind of had this one thing that was the big thing, and everything kind of orbited around that. But there was still the lament and the frustration with students, from parents and from church leaders and from myself and from volunteers, of how the youth group used to be so big and everybody used to come to everything. And, but everything was centered around this one thing. And it always, looking back on it, it's like, well, we only focused on this one thing. So why would they show up to other stuff?
Yeah.
if our focus was that. But I really resonated with that reading through the book and recognizing in the stories that he told, through the narrative that he kind of came up with the youth pastor and that student, and then the real life conversations that he had with parents to kind of meld this book together. I resonated with those things, and felt like that emulated some of my own experiences in youth ministry. Did you find anything like that as you were reading?
Yeah, there was, I wish I had tagged it, and I'm afraid I would spend too much time trying to find it now, but it was almost one of the more comical things for me was where he makes the point about how youth group used to be the place where young people even kind of tried on relationships. Do you remember that part? And I wish I could find it where it is in the book now. I had not even really consciously thought about that, but like in my first youth group, I can remember there being some love connections, and that was the thing we kind of had to watch for. And that is not the case now in 2020. And that part was almost comical to me because that was not something that I had realized that I had observed until he brought it out. I think for me, reading, especially the cultural analysis part, I'm a youth pastor and I'm also a mom. And so there were a lot of that part of it really made me think about myself as a parent and the parents of my kids. Because I think for me, what really resonated with my current experience in youth ministry is it's not lost on me how often my young people say that they are stressed or tired. Like I hear that a lot. And I get that there's teenagers and their bodies are growing and that they're tired. I mean, I get all of that. But I can remember a couple of years ago, so the first day of school was on a Thursday. They came into the youth room on the following Wednesday, so 6 days later. They've not even been in school a week. And I felt sort of gut punched because so many of them, these are 7th through 12th graders, came in talking about how stressed they were, how tired they are. They're 6 days into school. I mean, at that point, it's not even been 6 school days. And already they were kind of burning out. And you talked about, or you mentioned something a minute ago about, how they're kind of forming their identity. I think, and he makes the case for this too, back in the 80s and 90s, it was up to us to form our identity. I mean, we all know that that's something adolescents are doing, right? But I think that what we're seeing in this kind of cultural shift is that parents want a hand in helping form that identity. And again, I had observed that to be true, but not consciously known that that's what was happening. Because I look at he kind of makes the case that in our attempt to, as parents, to form the identity of our kids, we may be also creating the space for them to be so overextended. As a youth pastor, I'm thinking, yeah, I see this all the time, but as a parent, I feel kind of offended, like, hold on, because I only want good for my kids. And that's when I kind of do the face palm, because if you've read the book, good for you, and you'll know that that's kind of what Root is actually identifying and making the case for. We want good. Parents want good. But could it be that our definition of good is different than what it used to be? So he kind of poses these contributing factors that as parents, we don't want our kids to waste their lives. 100% true, right? We want them to construct their identity. Therefore, we fill their time with so many, again, good things, hoping that by doing so, they'll find their thing, the thing that will define them. Because what you're about, he says, is what defines you. And again, if I'm honest, as a youth pastor, there have been times that I've lamented and even said out loud, especially to my husband, sometimes I wish I were just a coach, because then at least I could require them to be here. Or I've even thought, are there other ways outside of the church to make a difference in the lives of young people? Because sometimes it seems like this is not where they are. Like physically, the church is not where they're at. And I feel the pressure of competing with everything else there is that fills up a young person's time. And that is just an icky feeling. I don't like that feeling.
You said something that it kind of sparked something, thinking about how your students, they're 6 days, 5 days into school, and they're already just, exhausted. And I thought, maybe that's not just school, but maybe that's also, they get done with school at the end of May. And then if they're a part of our ministry, they're going all summer long. Mm-hmm. Like there's trip after trip, event after event. Mm-hmm. And then they get to the end of July, and then it's school time, or, well, first off, it's probably like practice time for band or for a sport or mm-hmm. something like that, or summer mm-hmm. reading. And so they're cramming that, and then they go back to school. Maybe, we need to reflect as youth workers and youth ministers how we're contributing to their exhaustion when they first kick off at school. It's not, they're so just done with school by the time end of May, early June rolls around, right? And then we don't really nurture them to replenish them in a way that maybe doesn't help. Maybe it doesn't help with their exhaustion. Maybe it compounds it.
Well, and I think that Root would agree with you, because I think the point is, we want good. I mean, and so if summer trips and mission trips and conferences and camps are good, then we want those for our kids, and our kids want them too. I mean, I certainly don't think that there are a bunch of teenagers out there participating in a whole plethora of activities because their militant parents are making them. I don't think that's the case at all. I think all of us have hearts that are in the right place. And this is not what this book is about at all, but I do think that we have lost the practice of Sabbath when it comes to youth ministry, and of encouraging that because there's just not time because of all the things that we're doing. But I think what you're saying is right. I mean, all of those things are good. It's not bad to go to camps and conferences and retreats and mission trips. And that's kind of the point he's making. Everything they're doing is good. It's just a lot. And yeah. Where does youth ministry fit into that? How are we pastoring through that time?
For sure. I'm, just thinking about the book in general, where there's some, things that we talk about overall theme, but like, were there some key phrases or sentences or things that made you pause, or something that kind of stuck out to you? I'm sure there was one or two.
Here's where it gets really fun. Too bad I don't have my tabs in.
I'm glad you're bringing the book out so he knows we actually do own it and we read it. Here, I'll hold mine up too.
Because I'm sure he'll be watching this later.
Oh, he'll watch every second.
Okay. So I pulled out a few. This is the first one on page 16. Parents are under amazing pressure in our time, not only to not waste their own lives, but also to make sure their children don't either. I kind of alluded to that earlier. And of course, as parents, we're stewards of our children. I mean, we're called to be good stewards of these lives that we're entrusted to raise up. But it really made me pause to really consider the pressure that parents feel to give their kids a good life. And it makes me sympathetic to the pressure that we as parents feel. Parenting has never been an easy task. I mean, it's not like, suddenly the millennium switched and suddenly parenting got hard. I mean, and my experience as a parent is relatively finite. But that phrase in particular made me feel the weight of parents today. Then there was another one that I marked on page, well, there were lots that I marked, but that I particularly identified. This is page 99, again, with the parents. Parents want their kids to be happy, more so because they're frightened of them being sad. The sense is that if you can just pursue, procure, and perpetuate, that's a good sentence, a state of happiness, then sadness and all other negative emotions can have no place in your life. And again, as a parent, I get that. I don't want my kids to feel bad either. But as a person of faith and a pastor, I have to kind of take a step back and think about that. Because nowhere in Scripture are we promised to never feel bad. In fact, I think you could argue that Scripture is full of people who had pretty crappy days a lot of times. Faithfulness is never meant to mean easy street. But as you said earlier, it's rooted in joy. And I think when we attempt to curate happiness in the hope that the sad never comes, it's unrealistic. Happiness, he makes the point that happiness is a fleeting feeling, but that joy is something deeper than that. That joy is participating in the good, and that God is good.
And I think one of the points he makes in the book, and really in multiple books, is that it's in that moment, the one that parents are trying to alleviate, is where youth ministry can really speak. Me, just because I've read several of his books and have noticed a theme that this book really kind of, like I said at the beginning, kind of clarifies for me, is that if that point is true, that parents are trying to keep their kids happy in a way to where they suffer no sadness, no pain, they are removed and sheltered from that completely. I think what he is saying is that is a place where youth ministry really can thrive and exist for joy in those moments. And if parents are trying to get rid of that and alleviate that, where do we find ourselves then if we can't speak to the thing that is really our spot to help young people, not waste their life, or to share, what we have for youth ministry. So I think that page, that section there is really key to this book and to what Andrew Root is speaking about. What you're saying.
So I think that's kind of where he begins to make the shift, like the cultural analysis and through the theology and into the practice part of his book, because then he really defines what the joy and the good are. And so that comes actually in part on page 111, where he says, focusing on the good, that's a capital G, good, has become central to our ministry. I'd actually say that youth ministry is for joy, because youth ministry invites young people to focus on the good, capital G, and only God is good. Joy is when you find the good as an end. We find joy because we find something that comes straight from God. So to me, that's almost like the hinge point. He has now defined for us what this joy, youth ministry is for joy. Here's what it is. And we want good for our kids. Well, here's the capital G, good. And so he's making the case that we create space for joy, not fleeting happiness, but for joy when we allow young people to participate in the capital G, good.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many good quotes. There's so many good lines in the book. Just sitting around trying to pick them out is difficult.
Well, but we both identified one that we especially loved on page 166.
Yeah.
Do the honors.
Yeah, the one about how youth ministry should count something, but not how many young people are participating, but count how many stories young people are hearing and how many are invited to tell their own within the church. Probably universal. And so I really resonated with that. I mean, I think that's one of the difficulties in the proposal in general is the metrics of this. How do we measure if what we're doing has any bearing on success? And what is that? What is success? And for that to say, it's not how many bodies necessarily or in your ministry, because we know like you can have a large youth group and it means nothing. It's just a piece of a multitude of other things that they're doing. I always like to say, youth ministry a lot of times now for young people is the same way as when they used to play baseball. Like when I was a kid, I played baseball, or when I was a kid, I played piano. When I was a kid, I used to do youth ministry. And it's not, I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, or I'm a baseball player, or it's just something we used to do. And now we're moving towards something else. And for this, I think, what he's saying is, if our measuring stick is just people participating, that's not a good measure of this. But to count how many stories young people are hearing and how many are invited to tell their own, that is a good way to think this through on how we can decide if this is successful in a good measure.
Well, and the hard thing is, I would have to stamp that on my forehead, because even though I know that everything that he is saying and that you have just said is true, I would still feel a little disheartened if my youth group suddenly was cut in half. And I mean, we're not very good at delayed gratification, right? So for us, instant gratification is how many? What'd you have? Is it growing? We're not good at that individually or as a church. I would have to stamp that to my forehead, onto my hand so that I could read it, and onto my forehead so that, we all could read it, because those are the questions we ask.
Yeah.
So you had the retreat. How many did you have go? And there's nothing, people don't mean anything by that, but that's the tangible measuring stick.
Sure. And it is for most things.
Right.
Counting bodies and participants in that way is how we measure lots of things.
Right.
It's not just youth ministry, but yeah, maybe that's just not the best stick. And I think people have said this, I think this is something that people have pointed to and said before. We shouldn't be counting people. We should be thinking of other things. What is, the success of a ministry is not necessarily how many people are there. But yeah, it's a very difficult thing. And, as a youth minister, when I was in a congregation, but now serving a denomination, I have an even bigger youth group, is the way I see it. Yeah. And it is much more, you take things personal sometimes when you don't have the showing that you expect. Or for me, when people that I know have strong youth ministries, my colleagues, they don't bring their students, say, to your event or to your thing. So I think, there's a lot of ways that we measure things by participants and stuff that might not be helpful to us either.
Well, it's funny because, for one, I think that we all experience that. I think youth ministry is something, any kind of ministry, anyone who is a pastor, we pour ourselves into what we're doing, and then we cannot help but take it a little personal, even though it's not about us. But it's so funny us having this conversation, because now we're worshiping online, and I have one of my kids who has just completed first grade, and his favorite thing to do is to track the views that we have during worship. He reports to me. Yeah. But so see, he's first grade. He's not worried about church attendance, but also he's kind of worried about church attendance. That's a funny thing. It's just funny how quickly we are kind of indoctrinated into numbers matter.
For sure.
Okay, so I totally hogged the conversation on book quotes. Do you have others?
No, I underlined it a bunch, and like I said, the one that you quoted from page 99 about parents and trying to, remove that sadness from their kids' lives, that one stuck out, and that one about counting were two. The overall theme of the book really stuck out to me. Mm-hmm. And like I said, for me, this is a clarification of a lot of things that I feel like I've read him leading up to. And it was nice to kind of get there.
Yes, yes.
Because I think it's hard sometimes to nail down, a practicality or a thing that an author is really getting at. And I'm all for slow burns, but sometimes I need to hear what we're really talking about. And I think this book helps me understand a little bit more of what he's been talking about for a while now. And it seems like other people are noticing it as well. You had mentioned that there was another book by Kinder Dean about joy as well. So it'll be interesting to see how those connect and how they might not.
Yes, I need to order that one because I'm really curious.
Or Andrew, if you got some copies that she sent you, we'll take those as well.
Right. We're obviously, in-demand promoters for all youth ministry books.
It's hard sometimes because I just think Andrew Root is really on top of stuff. And I think that he really speaks to what's going on. It's hard to find some things that you don't quite connect with or understand, or you feel like is incomplete. And I know that I shared with you, and I think this comes from my own thinking currently and things that I'm pondering through the reading that I'm doing. But, one of the issues that I found in it is that I think there could be a limitation in that story mode and that story idea of what stories are shared and being shared, and are they just contextual stories, because that can be skewed by people's narrow view of the world, by their privilege. We exist in a denomination that is very white. And so we have a narrow scope sometimes, and maybe those stories over time are helpful with our own youth ministry, but maybe not helpful overall with faith formation in this kind of universal church that exists. I don't know. What about you? Was there anything that you feel like you'd like more on, or clarity on, or feel like might not necessarily connect with?
Well, when we both started reading the book, and we weren't necessarily reading it like in step with one another, but one of the first things that I had kind of said to you kind of early on was okay, you keep talking about middle class parents. Well, my youth group is economically and racially diverse. So I found myself thinking, especially initially before I really got into the book, okay, you keep talking about middle class families here, but that's not all that fuels our youth ministries. So those aren't the only stories I want to be sharing. That's not the only focus that I have. And I wasn't really offended by that. I get that his cultural analysis was really kind of hyper focused on this one particular group, middle class parents, and thus middle class kids. But in that way, it may not be as beneficial of a read or as exciting for a youth pastor serving in a context that doesn't align with his hyper focus. I don't know that it's something that's missing from this book so much as it could be something that's missing in general. Does that make sense? And so I guess in that way you could make the argument that it's missing from this book, but I wonder if we're talking about that enough in youth ministry, period.
Yeah, there, like we both know, there's a plethora of thought and books out there that we just don't know about. But these are the ones that are rising to the top, because these are the ones that are speaking to the most people. But just because it's most people doesn't mean it's all people. And I think that makes sense in my brain. And like you said, you can make sense of it for your own context, but it would be nice to not have to infer things or think of things on your own on how that connects. It'd be nice to read some stuff that just truly connects with your context and how your ministry is shaped. Any big takeaways or things that you feel like now that you've read this will filter into your ministry?
Well, in some ways it was kind of a fun affirmation of some of the work that we're doing. Like there were some of the lines from the book, even some of them that we shared with one another that I took pictures of and sent to some of my team because it was like, look, this is what we're doing. And so this is, it's kind of affirmation. Good. But I think overall, it mostly served as a good reminder that youth ministry is in a period of transition. There's trends in everything. And that's true in the church. There are trends in the church and in Christian education. But one trend that I've seen in just the last few years is returning to a good intentional focus on intergenerational ministry. That is not a new idea. Like, look at the Old Testament, like intergenerational ministry's been around forever. But there's a lot right now kind of trying to move us back toward it. Probably because the youth group of the 70s that still kind of exists today, what we've unintentionally done is separated the youth ministry out from the rest of the church. So I think that we're seeing that up here. And so there's this kind of gentle push towards returning to a good ministry where we're all connected across the ages. Storytelling too is another real kind of, I hate to say trend, because again, hello Old Testament.
I don't remember Jesus telling a story at all.
Yeah. So, but it's the stories that shape us. But there's a lot of books out right now. Have you read Saying is Believing by Amanda Drury? He quotes it in here. It's another good read about just the place of story in youth ministry in particular. But there are whole curriculums based around storytelling, so again, neither of these things are necessarily like newfangled. I think he just is aligning with this current kind of trend and push towards kind of reinventing or reimagining youth ministry. And so here at our church, we've developed this mantra: youth ministry is ministry. So in other words, we're trying to acknowledge that there should not be a disconnect between the youth group and the whole of the church. And our little youth ministry is ministry mantra is kind of influencing us in inches. And that's okay. I mean, we don't have to move hard and fast for the whole new way of doing ministry/youth ministry. But we are in the process of trying to kind of reimagine what youth ministry or how it could look different here in our context. And so this book was almost, like I said, a nice affirmation back to what we're kind of working towards right now anyway. What about you?
Yeah, I think I like the idea of a reminder, because I don't think really any youth ministry that I'm aware of, that I'm, connected to loosely through what I do, doesn't already practice some of these things.
Right.
Doesn't already have these moments, but they're just moments. They're not the central piece of what they do. And I think for me, that is probably a shift. We need not just fleeting moments of this or just inbreakings and ruptures of this when times get tough or desperation or coronavirus or whatever happens. But these things need to be much more centrally focused and upfront versus just kind of come out of necessity. So I think that's, for me, is pondering what that actually truly looks like. Because in the book, he uses a hypothetical ideal of a situation that has probably happened in some form or fashion in every congregation. A young person is affected deeply through a sickness or through a death or whatever it is. In the book, it's a sickness. And, I think we all kind of can navigate towards that, but how in the book, the scenario shifts it towards, the things that came from that, we're going to make that central versus what typically happens, and probably unfortunately what will probably happen as us as a society is we have this moment right now that things have shifted and we've had to put our focus towards different things, and we'll slowly but surely try to shift back to the way things were and how they are. And I think youth ministry tends to go for that low-hanging fruit sometimes. And I think he's trying to get us to reach for something deeper and something more, and do the hard work of, like, let's sit in these moments more and reflect on these and how these can be crucial and central to our ministries, not just, having crisis teams, basically.
Yeah. Well, and in that regard, I'll be curious to see how the church is different, how society is different, how families are different as we come out on the other side of coronavirus, whenever that may be. I mean, I don't think that's happening in the next couple of weeks, but how will this kind of fundamentally change who we all are? And so to me, it's any book that I can read as a youth pastor that kind of makes me feel excited about what we're doing. To me, that's a win. But I'll be curious to see how some of his ideas become especially timely and apt as we maybe sit on the beginning of another cultural shift. I hope we are. Anyway, I hope that we wisely glean something from this time and we don't just endure it and hop back into life as we knew it.
And hopefully the shift isn't the title of the book, but what the book is about.
Right. Yes.
I'm hoping the shift isn't the actual end of youth ministry.
Right.
Yeah. But it's always really good to read Andrew Root's thoughts. And I appreciate you joining me and kind of just talking through it and reviewing it a little bit.